Hey all, Aiden here, and thank you for electing to watch this video. But here's a question for you. How many votes would a president-elect need if they wanted to become president, and every citizen in the United States were to vote in the next election? More generally, how much is one vote worth? The answer is a bit counterintuitive because it seems like it should be simple. One person equals one vote, therefore whoever has the most votes will win. Just over 50% should net you the job. However, it's been calculated that a prospective president would be able to win with just 23% of the electorate. How is this possible? Well, the reason becomes clear when we realize that the Electoral College, the system which actually casts the vote for the next president, is an all-or-nothing system in which winning a state by one vote nets you all the Electoral College votes for that state. Therefore, any state that the candidate doesn't intend to win, we can just give 100% of the votes to the opponent. Using this method, Danielle Kurtzleben calculated in 2016 in an article for NPR, by winning only the biggest states in the Union and by winning by only one vote in each state, the theoretical candidate would only need to win the 11 most populous states in the country, with only 27% of the voting public. This is very impressive. However, if we instead go with the smaller states, the number is even smaller, largely because each state has a guaranteed minimum of 3 Electoral College votes. Therefore, by winning the 40 smallest states, which only takes 23% of the popular vote, the theoretical candidate would win the necessary 270 votes exactly and become president. It should be noted that this is simply not possible in the real world. This requires every single person in the states that the candidate loses to vote against them, and for each state to be won by only a single vote. But it is an interesting thought experiment and shows that the election system doesn't necessarily reflect the will of the majority of the people. Speaking of the majority of the people, voter turnout has always been an interesting topic in this democracy. It's not hard to find rhetoric discussing why voting doesn't matter, and one can often be disenfranchised with the lack of impact their votes seem to have. In the 2016 presidential election, the turnout was remarkably high, with 55.7%, meaning well over half the voting-aged public cast their votes. However, something to keep in mind is that if no one had been a candidate on the ballot, they would have won handily, with about 121 million votes, almost twice as much as either of the candidates. In fact, the 2016 presidential election is an interesting thing to look at in terms of voter turnout in our democracy, because the truth is that we don't live in a democracy. Literally. According to Washington Post author Eugene Volokh, there has been much contention over the years about the exact definition of the U.S. system of government, but the most common and perhaps most fitting is representative democracy. We don't usually vote directly for the laws to be enacted, but instead on the people who make the decisions on which laws to enact. This is done famously, and perhaps controversially, through the presidential elections run through the Electoral College, from which a candidate must win at least 270 of a possible 538 votes to win. There's been a lot of contention over the existence of the Electoral College as of late. In famous cases such as Bush vs. Gore in 2000, and even more recently, the aforementioned 2016 presidential election between Trump and Clinton, the popular vote and the Electoral College don't always agree. With the Clinton vs. Trump election, Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, roughly 2% of the total electorate, but Trump won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, with over 75 more electoral votes than Clinton. This brings us back to the central question of this video. How much is a vote worth? Well, that largely depends on where you live. According to Adam McCann of Wallet Hub, larger states have inherently less power in the Electoral College. Each state's Electoral College votes are allocated based on their total seats in the Senate and the House, and it's the latter that raises a real problem. Each state gets the same number of senators because the founders were worried about bigger states being able to push smaller states around. So each state has equal representation in the Senate and representation based on population in the House. When the states were first created, this meant that each electoral vote was roughly equal. But as states grew exponentially in size, it becomes massively more difficult to balance these votes out, especially with the guaranteed 2 votes not reliant on how populous a state is. This all might be a little abstract, so let's throw in some concrete numbers. California, the most populous state in the Union, has a population of roughly 39.5 million, while Wyoming, the least populous state, has 579,000. However, California has 55 Electoral College votes, while Wyoming has only 3. By dividing the total number of potential voters by the electoral votes, we can calculate that each electoral vote in Wyoming has to represent only 193,000 people, whereas each Californian electoral vote represents 718,182, rounded up, votes. Remember that Wyoming has fewer total people in it than each electoral vote represents in California, you can start to see where this might be a state of emergency. But hold on, you might be thinking. That's a total population size, not electorate size. And you'd be totally right. The size of the voting population is much different than the total population. In McCann's aforementioned article, he gave us more concrete answers on which state has the most voting power, factoring in things like population, number of delegates, whether the state is a swing state, etc. His findings still hold roughly true to our thought experiment, though. Wyoming has the most voting power, with each vote representing a total of 3.06 peoples, while California actually finds itself in the middle, just outside of the bottom third, with a voting power of 0.89, a bit under one person, one vote. Georgia draws the short straw here, with just 0.56 people represented for each ballot cast. This is all well and good if you wanted to find out which vote is the most valuable. What if you wanted to find out how much one vote is actually worth? How can you find a value of something like a vote? Well, Robert Wiblin wanted to tackle the very issue in his article, How Much is a Vote Worth? And his findings led to some interesting conclusions. According to Wiblin, we need to break down the value of votes into two categories in order to determine their value. How likely is my vote to change the outcome of an election, and how much better is one candidate than the other? For the first one, it seems that one person's vote isn't likely to change anything, and that is generally true, but one vote can actually have a much more impact than you might think. If you live in a safe state such as California, then it's very unlikely for you to swing the election with your vote. Your chances of swinging the election are effectively zero. However, under the ideal circumstances, in a swing state such as Florida with even polling, statistician Andrew Gelman of Columbia University calculated that your chances of swinging an election with your vote are as high as 1 in 1 million. With hundreds of millions of people in voting public, these odds are actually incredibly high. To put that into perspective, this is 18 times higher than chances of winning the lottery. It's about as likely as you are to get struck by lightning. Talk about a shocking development. However, it's the second half of Wiblin's calculation where things get interesting. Wiblin used a similar voting power method as Ketzelman, but he also factored in the total national budget over 4 years, approximately $14.6 trillion. And calculated through his 1 in 10 million estimation, Wiblin gets a number rough in estimation but powerful in sentiment. 1.4 million is the total voting power of a voter in a swing state. If you're voting in a state where you have a chance to turn the electorate, your vote approximately counts for $1.5 million of the budget. Even if you don't think you're going to change the outcome, the sheer amount of money being thrown around makes it a very pragmatic way for you to go about spending your election day. If all that doesn't convince you, remember that votes aren't just about the president. In fact, most immediate change doesn't come from the president at all, but from the state and local elections. And those elections are both much smaller and more direct. Furthermore, many elections also have ballot initiatives, things on which you vote directly. If nothing else, voting for these can be a very good use of your time, as those are often very close. Overall, should you vote? Is it worth your time? The answer is ultimately up to you, but given what we've gone over today, I believe we can say for certain that votes matter more than you might think. If you live in a swing state, your vote actually has a statistically very high chance of changing the election. Even if you don't, you're still voting with a massive amount of money in terms of how much of the budget your vote represents. And considering the state, local, and ballot initiative aspects of elections, your individual vote does matter, even if it might not seem like it at times. And as always, thanks for watching.